Hello?
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 We can't hear the room.
No, Mr. Roush.
Okay, folks, we're on the webinar. We're working on that right now. We're just doing introductions in the room.
Municipal with NYMTC. David Biana from Nassau County.
Chris Hardy, New York City, TCC of NYMTC.
And the last few people over here on this side, and then we'll get started.
John Simpson, New York City, TCC of NYMTC.
Situational, NYMTC staff.
Christian Higgins, Cambridge Systematics.
And of course, the immortal
John Kahn, NYMTC staff.
Thank you, Mr. Kahn. Okay, great. So welcome everyone. For those on the webinar, hopefully you can hear.
I'm sorry. NJTPA is Representative Solomon Cabinets. Good afternoon.
Welcome, Solomon. Thank you. Thank you for being here. So for the folks on the webinar, hopefully you can hear the proceedings. Again, we're asking everyone in the room to use the microphones, even though it's a little clumsy, so the folks on the webinar can hear what we're saying. So you see the agenda on the screen right now. We're going to be talking about how we're restarting this network and a little bit about the new charge we've been given by the members of NYMTC. A couple of minutes we'll spend on transformational change and Transportation System Management and Operations, or TSMO, because that's really of the moment right now, and we're all either taking advantage of that or anticipating these changes in the developing of the programs that you're all working on. Then we'll have some information about current developments impacting TSMO, and a presentation on the Integrated Corridor Management Deployment Planning Grant that was received by New York City DOT. Then a roundtable discussion on transportation network companies, and finally we'll talk about meeting frequency going forward and future agenda items. Okay? So, moving forward, restarting the network. So, the Metropolitan Mobility Network was originally created by the NYMTC members back in the late 1990s, and about 10 years later, the ITS working group was coalesced into the Metropolitan Mobility Network. For the last 2+ years, this network has not met, mainly due to the fact that we were on the hook here at NYMTC to complete and adopt the regional transportation plan that's now in place. But we have now restarted the network in conjunction with something called the Metropolitan Area Planning Forum, which is a consortium of 9 MPOs in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania that cover basically the multi-state metropolitan region. So one of the reasons Solomon is with us today is because of the MAP forum. So we're trying to expand this, and the Metropolitan Mobility Network has always been more than just the NYMTC planning area, but rather bringing in the other states surrounding to have a truly metropolitan dialogue. The network is focused on this broad area of Transportation System Management and Operations, or TSMO, which includes demand management, system management, integrated corridor management, intelligent transportation systems, a number of different areas. And this broad area is also evolving through technology, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The network itself consists of the staff and the member agency staffs of NYMTC and the Map Forum member MPOs and COGs that are involved in these TSMO programs. And we will be involving other organizations, and there are certainly other organizations here on an as-needed basis. But this is an advisory group to NYMTC's board and to the other MPOs based on everyone's expertise and knowledge. How to best use money in the area of TSMO and what kind of programs and plans we need to be making. So the charge to the group, the new charge to the group, is to advise and inform with regard to TSMO. These are advisory working groups, and hopefully what we're doing here is mining information and expertise and forwarding advisory opinions to the MPO boards who are actually making the decisions on funding priorities. So we'll provide, this network will provide going forward advice, research, and it'll be a collaborative forum. And if you look at the full charge statement, which is amongst the things that were being handed out, you'll notice that under number 4, there's a listing of the areas that the network has been asked to really focus on. And a number of these areas are the types of things that are developing now through technology, things like mobility as a service, shared mobility, mobility on demand, mobility management, including for people with disabilities. And you can see active transportation demand management, integrated corridor management. These are the types of areas that we're being asked to really look at as this particular network, and our future agendas will be driven by these areas. So, before I get into transformational change, are there any questions about what the network is, what we're being asked to do by the MPOs and COGs that are involved? Okay, great. So now let's move forward into the next agenda item, which is transformational change and TSMO. So, our current plan, which was adopted in, this would be NYMTC's current plan, which was adopted in 2017, in June of 2017, has an entire section on transformational change, drivers of change, and trying to anticipate in the long term how conditions may change for transportation going forward. And these potential changes obviously could significantly transform when, how, and why people are traveling and goods are being moved. That's the key part that we're trying to anticipate here, and we're trying to affect also. It's not just a passive watching this happen, but rather how can this be used in many ways to further the shared goals of all the different MPOs and COGs. So now our particular plan talks about anticipating how personal mobility may change, including it states that likely in the longer term, a movement away from vehicle ownership and increased use of shared on-demand, possibly autonomous vehicles. And again, our current plan is through 2045, so we're talking about 28 years into the future. Goods movement also could be greatly impacted by technological changes. And you see them listed there. I think distributed and additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, has the potential to completely transform how goods are moved. But there are other technologies, too, that may be acting on the movement of goods. So another part that the plan looks at is the fact that there are new types of data now available, becoming available, they are available, they will be available. And that's going to also affect how transportation services are provided and used. We're certainly seeing that through things like ride-hailing services and the use of smartphones to mobility as a service to both select from transportation options and also to identify when services are operating and where they're operating. This new type of data may also be used increasingly in the management of the transportation system, and may result, and is resulting, but also may result in the future in new organizational arrangements for service provision and for facility management. So that whole area of big data is part of the transportation transformation. Of course, metropolitan regions also are being affected by large changes, major global trends, and you see listed here what's in the plan: climate change, future availability and cost of fuels, the development of new technologies and energy sources, and changing demographics and lifestyle expectations. All these things are out there in front of us, and they're beginning to have impacts now, and they'll certainly have impacts going forward. And the challenge for any planning organization is to try to harness them and also to anticipate what they may be as we go forward in time. So the implications for transportation are, the plan states that there's little doubt that some combination of these drivers of change will have an impact on either demand for transportation or the way the service is provided. It's happening now, and so we're seeing it, and there's likely to be an even greater impact going forward. Now, when is this all going to happen? Well, that's the $64,000 question, actually, and we don't really have a really good handle on how this is all going to roll out. But what we did is, based on our review of media reports and research that exists right now, we put together a very speculative timeline. For example, from now until roughly 2025, connected and autonomous vehicles are becoming legal and are being tested and pilot tested. And shared mobility on the other side, which we'll get into a little bit in a minute, is continuing to evolve. So over the next 5 to 7 years, these things are happening and will continue to happen. And then in the decade of the 2020s, connected and autonomous vehicles are introduced in services where drivers are a cost factor. That's what we're anticipating. We've seen that a lot in the literature. We've also seen literature that says this isn't going to happen, but it sort of makes sense that it would potentially happen first with ride-hailing services or potentially goods movement where truck drivers are a cost factor and so forth. That these would be the first areas where truly autonomous vehicles are introduced. There'll be increasing levels of automation in privately owned vehicles, and shared mobility will increasingly impact private vehicle ownership. So you have, how much private vehicle ownership there'll be going forward is really an open question, and how these technologies will be introduced into the private fleet or the fleet that's available for use is the other part of that equation. In the 2030s, it's possible that fully automated CAVs, we're talking about levels 4 and 5 here in the automation scale, will become a significant portion of the private vehicle fleet. And, but that vehicle fleet will remain mixed with varied levels of automation. There'll be a continuing evolution of shared mobility. And again, the plan posits that this will be away from private ownership of vehicles. But the level of automation in this decade would not be sufficient for advanced traffic management. So because the fleet is mixed and, maybe at best 50% of the vehicle fleet, we're talking about all the vehicles out there, might be fully automated at this point, maybe less, there won't be the opportunity to apply the technology to managing traffic as a whole, because the vehicle mix is still, the vehicle fleet rather is still mixed. And then by the 2040s, this is when we could potentially see a major share of vehicles becoming fully autonomous, and that the level of automation may therefore be sufficient for advanced traffic management and higher levels still of shared mobility. This is a completely speculative look. It's a guess. It's a somewhat educated guess. It may be different than this. It may not. But if we look out into the future, at least based on what we see now, this is a somewhat reasonable way to look at how things may play out over time. There are some wild cards. You see them here, things that we really don't know about. And among them are, distributed manufacturing, the future of e-commerce, commercial vehicle automation, these types of things. We're not quite sure about these, but they all could have major impacts on this timeline. And we'll just have to keep watching and trying to get a handle on how things are evolving. The elements of shared mobility, I think you probably all know what this is, but it's really it's a portfolio or a market basket or whatever you want to say, but it involves all kinds of different things and approaches that are now possible using the technology that's available. You see them listed here. We're not going to go through these in a lot of detail right now, but these are the types of things that really form the basis of the charge to this particular network going forward. And then, of course, there's the hype cycle. We don't really know whether these technologies are going to take off. And this is a very interesting graph that shows that some technologies have inflated expectations and then plummet into what they refer to as the trough of disillusionment. And sometimes that means they just go into the valley of oblivion and are never heard from again. But there's a recovery from that too, which may end up in what's called a plateau. So this is an interesting way to visualize what might happen with these technologies. It's not guaranteed that autonomous vehicles will take over the market and be the entire fleet of vehicles out there in the future. There's a probability. This is all a question of probability. So where does it end up on the hype cycle is important. And
Your entry is not valid, or the meeting has not started yet. Re-enter your access code or meeting number, followed by pound.
You see, this is what happens when technology is in the trough of this. So we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. So, you know, we really don't have a clear view about how this is going to play out. And we can point to other technologies, certainly recently, that have not taken off and have not been realized fully. Think of Google Glass. But, you know, 25 years ago, we never would have anticipated that everybody would have a smartphone in this room right now either. So it's really a question of probabilities now and speculation in terms of what we're facing going forward. So I want to stop there and ask if there are any questions about that part. I think it's important for this network to think in terms of this transformation of transportation that's happening and will evolve over the future, and how that's going to affect the planning for the future. So any questions or points about anything we've said up to this point? Did we miss any major points in this assessment of transformation? Okay, it's great to hear. So we'll keep that in mind in our agendas as we go forward, and I want to move on now to some current developments impacting TSMO. This is agenda item 4, starting with 4A, Rosemary Mascali from Transit Solutions. We'll talk about the impact of tax reform on the commuter benefit. So, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. Okay, so today I'll be talking just a little review on what is the pre-tax transit benefit for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Then the impact of the tax code changes on the pre-tax benefit, a little bit about New York City commuter benefit law, and then the impact we're seeing on the marketplace today. So the pre-tax transit benefit is an IRS provision that allows employees to pay for their transit expenses with pre-tax dollars. The IRS allows up to $260 per month to be designated by the employee as transit expenses and non-taxable income. That makes it free of federal, New York State, New York City, and FICA payroll taxes. And I know there's some New Jersey people here, but I'm focusing on New York State impacts right now. There's an estimated 1 million NYMTC-related commuters that take advantage of this benefit. And it's estimated that the tax subsidy is somewhere around $500 million from all of those commuters taking advantage of the tax benefit. This has been around for a very long time, expanded with the New York City commuter benefit law. The hitch is that employers must offer the benefit to their employees for employees to take advantage of it. In the past, there was no cost to the employer to offer this. They actually got payroll tax savings as well in the form of FICA tax savings. So it was a pretty easy sell to, encourage employers to offer this benefit to their employees, because there was a small administrative cost that the transit benefit providers were charged, but that was more than covered by their FICA tax savings, and the employee could save up to $1,200 a year. However, with tax reform, that's changed, and there's now a significant disincentive for companies to offer this benefit, and that's what the concern is. So I'm going to go through an example of what changed. So before tax reform, employees could deduct up to $260 per month free of federal, state, New York City, and FICA payroll taxes and save up to $1,200 a year. That was under what's called Chapter 132 of the IRS Code. And after tax reform, that's exactly the same. There's been no changes in that aspect. So if employees have the pre-tax benefit, they can still deduct up to $260 per month and save up to $1,200 per year. I'm with Transit Solutions that promotes transit, particularly on Long Island, to improve the air quality. We're a CMAQ-funded program. So for Long Island Railroad riders, most of them are saving $1,200 a year, so it's significant. Now for employers, the way it worked before was they could save 7.65% in their FICA payroll tax on the amount the employee deducts for transit. So that could save them, for an employee that deducted the maximum amount, about $20 a month, and the typical charge that a transit check or WageWorks or Commuter benefit solution transit benefit provider would charge is about $5 or $6 per month. So the employers, you know, on the ones taking the full amount would actually save money. On the average, you have people just buying Metro cards or doing less. So I always presented it as it kind of broke even. You had some savings, but it covered the cost, and you had this free benefit for your employees. In the old days, whatever the employee deducted as taxes, as a transit benefit, was still deductible to the business as a wage expense, even though technically it was no longer wages, but a tax-free benefit. What changed is the employees can still deduct the 7.65% FICA, but they can no longer deduct as a business expense the amount that the employee deducts for transit or the amount that the employer subsidized. Either one is no longer considered wages and therefore not deductible as a business expense. Any qualified transportation benefit is no longer deducted as calculated as a business expense. I've focused here on the pre-tax transit benefit, but this applies also to the parking benefit as well, which is the other end. Van pooling, train, bus, and parking are no longer deducted. So we say, what does that cost the business? So with the new federal business income tax rate is 21%. That's a nice drop from what was before. So you could say, well, they're getting a lot of benefit from there, so that's good. But the New York State and the New York City and the NTA tax is linked to the federal tax rate. So whatever is not deductible for federal is also not deductible for New York State, New York City, and the NTA tax is calculated based on the New York State tax. So when you add all those taxes together, it comes out to 37.15% that the employer now loses as a business deduction and therefore costs them. So here's an example of my Long Island Railroad rider. So typically a Long Island Railroad rider deducts the maximum $260 per month. So the total wages excluded, if they did the $260 per month, is now $3,120. Doesn't show up on their W-2, it's completely non-taxable income. The tax savings is up to $1,200 a year, depending on what tax brackets the employee was. So if they're making about $50,000 a year or more, they're probably saving $1,200. If they're making less than that, then they might be saving 25–30%, depending on, you know, what the federal, state, city, and FICA rates are for them. Now the employer, in the past, as I mentioned, it didn't cost them anything. They sometimes even saved a little money. Now they've lost the business deduction of $3,120 because that's now not considered wages. And so their increased taxes, if they're at the full, now every business has different tax situations, so assuming they're at the tax rates we just covered on the last chart, they would have to pay $1,159 in increased taxes, almost as much as what the employee is saving. In some cases, more than what the employee is saving if their tax rates were lower. So in effect, the full cost of the pre-tax transit subsidy that we've all enjoyed over these years has been transferred from government to business. And I don't know how many people realize that. It happened, you know, over Christmas without much discussion. The impact on nonprofits is also, there's an impact on nonprofits in a different way. Even though nonprofits don't pay taxes, so therefore the business income tax doesn't apply, nonprofits pay something called unrelated business taxable income, or the acronym UBTI. In the past, qualified transportation benefits was not considered unrelated taxable business taxable income. That changed with tax reform. Now, whatever amount that the employee deducts for transit or that the nonprofit subsidizes and provides to that employee, up to the $260 per month in any combination, is now considered UBTI and is taxable at the federal rate of 21%. And again, the New York State UBTI is linked to the federal, so if the amount taxable went up on federal, it automatically goes up on state, of 9% for a total of 30%. The trouble with nonprofits is they didn't benefit from a decrease in the business tax rate, income tax rate, so to offset this expense. So it's particularly hurting nonprofits because it's kind of coming out of left field with nothing to offset it. So on Long Island, I gave a couple of examples, Northwell Health, Hofstra. This includes the hospitals, the universities, all nonprofits that are subject to the UBTI. So you could say, well, that's okay because New York City has a commuter benefit law that requires companies with 20 or more employees to offer the pre-tax benefit to their employees. The problem is that the penalty was never meant to be punitive. It's $250 per month for the whole company, a total of $3,000 per year. You can have 3 Long Island Railroad riders and you break even. So there's a concern. We have about a $500 million subsidy that used to come through the federal, the state, and the city, and the FICA payroll taxes. It's now up to businesses to keep offering that. And will they, is the question. So what we're seeing so far, there's been an outcry from the nonprofit sector. Several bills have been introduced at the state and the federal level to try to fix that. It started with the state level in the legislative session. Both the Assembly and the Senate passed a bill that would decouple the New York State UBTI from the federal as it relates to qualified transportation benefits. It hasn't been signed yet by the governor, but it would at least roll back the 9% up to 30% for nonprofits. On the federal side, there are a number of bills in the House and in the Senate that are trying to roll it back entirely. In that case, the New York State piece wouldn't be necessary. There's 2 versions right now. On the Republican side, it's a pure rollback with no strings attached. There's a competing Democrat bill that's asking for that plus an increase in the corporate tax rate from 21 to 22%. If anyone in the room knows anything more about where that's going, there's a lot of different senators, Assemblyman, Ted Cruz introduced a bill on the Senate side that's similar to the one that's just a no strings attached repeal of it. I don't know where it stands right now, but we can talk about that. So far on the business side, there's been minimal noise, which is good. Let me see my fingers crossed. Companies continue to offer this benefit. When I've tried to poll, where people are with it, they feel it's something that their employees depend on and really value. It would be very difficult for them to drop. They also just enjoyed a big drop in their federal tax rate, so the optics of it would not be very good to suddenly drop it, but we should understand that it's not required now, and the penalty is not substantial. I'm also concerned that there might be a lack of awareness of what this impact is, even within transit benefit providers. As I talk to reps from them, there's different understandings and different explanations about what the impact of this law is on them. So I think there might be a lack of information about, what the full impact is that over time, could become a problem. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions or additional information based on what Rosemary was talking about? Anyone? Oh, I'm sorry, David.
Hi, I have 2 comments. First of all, Rosemary covered very, very well the issues that are out there. On the UBTI, what's interesting to note is this is probably the first time in tax history that anybody has ever been taxed on an expense. And that's what's creates a lot of the problem with the UBCI nonprofits. Secondly, just related as a matter of information, New Jersey State Senate on Monday, the Senate Budget Committee sent a bill to the full Senate to have a statewide ordinance in New Jersey. The ordinance, trans-benefit ordinance, is pretty much parallel what's being offered in New York City. So that's to go to the Assembly, go to their Budget Committee, but it's well on its way. The reason I mention it is that Loretta Weinberg, the state senator that sponsored it, has put it all over the news. You'll probably hear it tonight in various places. So I just wanted to bring that up, that there's a parallel effort there.
Just got a practical question. When an employee gets $260 benefit for transportation, and it's in the form of a Metro card, there's no way of knowing whether that employee is going to use it for work or, unlimited card. They can use it for payment, travel.
The IRS Chapter 132 states for transit passes that the requirement is that the employee buy a transit pass. It's not specifically worded that what the pass has to be used for. Van pooling is specifically noted just to and from work, as is parking just related to parking related to work. But the line item that talks about a transit pass says they have to buy a transit pass.
Does that mean not a Metro card?
A Metro card is an example of a transit pass. So any ticket that would take you on to transit is considered a transit pass.
So it's beneficial that I can use it other than going to work. I understand.
Yes.
Is that taken into account in terms of the overall impact?
With the exception of federal employers, of the federal government being very strict, most employers just assume that it's an added benefit. The IRS has never ruled that you can't do it. In fact, they kind of accept it.
Just wanted to point it out.
Yeah, it's not an issue.
However, we now know what you're doing with your transit pass. We'll take that up with you. Jack, can I ask you a question? Sorry to put you on the spot, but New York City still has a requirement, legislative requirement, for employers to offer a transit check, correct?
A transit benefit, not necessarily a transit check.
Right, yes, right. So, situations like this, that's increasingly putting the burden on the business, and since they're required to do it, and how...
Well, again, if they're required or they're subject to penalties. The penalty is $3,000 a year. So my question, I guess, is New York City looking at that in terms of, or the legislative, I guess, in increasing that penalty, because it was never meant to be punitive, because basically it was a no-brainer to offer the benefit. It was meant to just encourage companies to take a look at it, and once they did, they were like, why wouldn't I do this? Now, it's a little different calculus.
We don't know if the City Council is looking at that right now.
No. The Department of Consumer Affairs, the Department of Consumer Affairs is charged with enforcing it. And the New York City ordinance is done on an exception basis rather than, say, the Bay Area where there's paperwork to be filed. I would suggest that you have Consumer Affairs come into a future meeting and talk about how they enforce the commuter benefit.
Other questions or information for Rosemary? Okay, great. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you. Yeah. So I just want to point out a few things out before we get into the next agenda item. And first of all, Rosemary, you mentioned that Transit Solutions is CMAQ funded. CMAQ is Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Funding. So that's a federal funding program. And, for on Long Island, NYMTC members have decided to continue to fund that particular program in order to be able to market this transit benefit, which is very impactful in the suburban areas, very powerful. Same in the city, but of course, city transit use is much, much higher than the suburban areas. So that's the type of thing we're talking about when we're talking about device from this network, because those funding decisions still need to be made going forward. So this is really a powerful method of demand management, this commuter benefit, and how it's marketed in our region is really important, and in New Jersey and in Connecticut and surrounding areas. So, Solomon, do you have anything to add to what's happening in New Jersey on that?
Nothing other than looking forward to hearing the news tonight.
Right. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is another part of the shared mobility basket, shall we say, that is also developing now, microtransit. If we go back to this slide, I'm not suggesting we do, that has all the different elements of shared mobility. Microtransit is there, and it's a little bit different than ride-hailing or transportation network companies, but it's akin to them. So, Kirk, it's great that you're here to talk a little bit more about what microtransit is and how it's being deployed in our region. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Do you mind if I steal that mic? Yeah. Yeah, well, okay. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm Kirk Hogan-Cotter. I'm a program associate with Transit Center. If you don't know us, we are a foundation committed to improving public transit. And we do that through grants to transit advocates across the country. We do national opinion surveys to figure out why riders are taking transit and why they don't. And we use that to inform our research and reports. We also do workshops with transit agency board members and staff on a variety of topics. And we also provide direct technical assistance to transit agencies on topics of how to reduce bus bunching to how to better design bus networks. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk about microtransit and this topic and actually get to some, have some real talk, actually talk about what we think about when we talk about transit and also just talk about kind of the principles of transit in general. So one thing that I want to highlight, and I want to talk about when we use the term microtransit, what are we actually talking about? And I'm curious in the audience here, when you hear the term microtransit, what do you think? I'd love for an example of something from the audience. What are people envisioning when they think of the term microtransit?
I think of van pooling for some reason.
All right, van pooling. Yeah. Any others? Via service that we see on the streets of New York here and Chicago and Los Angeles.
Do you mean the one that's operating in Boston, that service there? For those services, if it's operating, it would be like microtransit. That's your 15, 16 passengers. Charity?
Yeah, exactly.
Transit is about charity, also. Those are operating and on pilot.
All right, well, when we're getting to this kind of conclusion that when people say this term, they're thinking of vans that are smaller than buses, larger than cars that carry people. But we need to get to this point of realizing that this is not going to replace transit. When a lot of people think that microtransit or TNCs or on-demand services are going to replace transit, it's just not going to happen. When we imagine take the L train shutdown, for instance, the 250,000 daily riders trying to get into the city of New York, we're not going to be able to fit all of those people on cars or small vehicles. And one, it just comes back to something basic of geometry, that I know you've all seen this is classic, that we show that how much space each of these modes takes up. And buses and transit are especially efficient at moving people. When we talk about other modes, like Uber or autonomous vehicles, or even microtransit, you're still taking up far more space than you do in a transit vehicle. That's transit's strategic value. It's how we move people through cities and how we make cities work. And this is critical because the most expensive part of a transit vehicle is the driver, is the labor. It's not the size of the vehicle. It's not if you go to a small microtransit van, you're going to be saving money because you still need that staff person to drive it. So going back to this geometry question of microtransit is critical, and why that microtransit is not going to replace real public transit and great investments in subways and buses that we desperately need here in New York City and across the country. And that's critical because transit is the best way to move massive amounts of people. We see that here in New York, and we see that in other places across the country. As certain cities and conversations occur of, do we need transit if we're going to have autonomous vehicles or Uber or microtransit to replace these services? how we can make our cities function, and transit is the key to doing that. It just moves multiple times more people than these other services can. But, so let's look at some of these pilots that have been occurring. When we think of microtransit, we think of things like this van, this service bridge that the Kansas City Transit Agency implemented in Kansas City. And at the time, it was hailed and it was incredibly buzzy as this is going to be the future of transit. This is how people can use their phone to hail a ride to get them to go from one place to another. The Kansas City Transit Agency spent $1.2 million to run this pilot, and over the course of 6 months, they only had about 600 rides. That's well, sorry, that is well over $1,000 per ride. This isn't sustainable. And the more glaring issue here was when this transit agency set out what they want to do with this microtransit pilot, there weren't clear objectives. They wanted to test it out. They wanted to improve the customer experience. But we need to get down to what that really means, and also what is your goal as a transit agency? If your goal is to move more people, then why are you spending $1.2 million on a pilot like this and not more bus service on the ground? Another example we see of transit agencies looking at microtransit is LA Metro. They are currently doing a microtransit pilot in Los Angeles. The issue here is that bus ridership in LA is declining significantly, even more than here in New York City. And while the LA Metro is doing significant things to try and improve their bus system, like doing a bus network redesign, they're also starting to run just an innovation checklist. They're looking at adding things like bike share or microtransit or doing mobility on demand pilots. And they're still not asking themselves the tough questions on what is the outcome we want here? What do we want this microtransit pilot to do? And really they need to be honest with themselves is, can this scale? And I think the entire field, and especially here in New York, we need to be honest with us. Can this scale? And so we see in LA, as they start to develop this, us as advocates need to be making sure they're asking themselves the tough questions, but as we look at it more closely here in New York, we need to ask ourselves the tough questions of, is this going to be a solution, and what do we want out of it? And the places that have done that really well is in Northern California, not Southern California. AC Transit, the transit system in the Oakland, Richmond, and East Bay communities in the Bay Area did a pilot like this. They used a microtransit pilot that could be called from your phone, was very similar to van pool or DART or dial-a-ride services that we have today, but they were looking at it, how would this work if we change some of the fixed route networks around it and use this as a way to feed into those. And they were really realistic about how they measured this pilot. They were only aiming for this pilot to reach 7 passengers per hour. And that really, after they implemented for about a year, that was the ceiling that they reached. And they were evaluating this pilot on the exact same way that they were evaluating their existing transit service. How many boardings did it have per hour? How many boardings did it have per revenue hour, per revenue mile? And they weren't looking at metrics that were customer experience, that were really fluffy and don't mean anything. And so I thoroughly encourage you, if you want to learn more about this topic, one, we've written an incredible blog post about this pilot, and we interviewed John Urgo, the head of this pilot, who shares a lot about their thinking on this. And they were really good at using these comparative measures and saying, this is going to be a clear success for us if it meets this ridership goal, or if in the entire service area, the fixed route ridership and the on-demand microtransit pilot ridership increases. And if it decreases by this much, then it's a success. And they were very clear that they wanted to make this revenue neutral. They didn't want to have to spend more money to get a service that wasn't going to drive more ridership when they knew that they just made those fixed bus routes on those routes more frequent, they would get more riders. And one thing that transit agencies who have started to look into this, one of the values they really find of microtransit pilots or on-demand pilots is how they can be used politically to make your fixed route bus system better. Take cities like Austin, where Cap Metro, their transit agency, totally revamped their bus network earlier this year. They went from only having 3 bus routes. All right, thank you. All right, spot. There we go. Hello. Or I can go from this mic here too. Cap Metro in Austin, they went from 3 bus routes that had 15-minute or better frequent service to 14 overnight by restructuring their bus networks, similar to what the MTA is looking to do in some of their other, on the boroughs here in New York. But there were neighborhoods where fixed route bus service just wasn't justifiable. So they were able to talk to residents to say, hey, we want to work with you on some sort of on-demand pilot to make sure that you still have some base level of service, but they could use their revenues and service hours where it was going to drive more ridership. So there are a lot of different ways to think about what outcomes do you want from these microtransit, these on-demand pilots. But here in New York, as someone mentioned earlier, we start to see these services like Chariot, which are owned by Ford and deeply subsidized by venture capital, running on our streets. And my colleague, Joelle Balam-Schwan, investigated riding on some of these. And in just her very small anecdotal experience, there wasn't much ridership on these services. And one, it's also very difficult to get ridership numbers from some of these private companies. But we need to ask, are these services that we want to be encouraging in New York City for people to get around? And right now, going back to Rosemary's presentation, Via and Chariot, you can use your pre-tax subsidy to take these services. And as we look at the city or as we look at our own code, is this something we want to be encouraging? And so what I really want us to get back to is microtransit is a buzzy topic. It's a buzzy name. Let's start actually talking about what these services actually are. And these are low ridership, on-demand services that can meet certain specific needs, but we need to be clear about what we want these services to accomplish if we're going to put public dollars in them and not in fixed route bus service. And I'm happy to talk to you more about this conversation and about this topic. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm going to actually, you can applaud. I'm actually going to start the questions by asking, so how exactly, I mean, is a microtransit, there are areas in NYMTC's planning area. I'm thinking Hudson County, the east end of Suffolk County, some places in northern Westchester, where this model may actually be more effective and less costly than running buses on schedules. But how does it actually work? Is it like a TNC on steroids? How do you book the trips, and how do the routes get deployed?
And that's a great question. As we've started to see in a place like Oakland, where AC Transit did their Flex pilot, it's something just like you call up an Uber on your phone, or how Access-a-Ride works today. You reserve it, you say a specific time window, and someone will come in that time window. It's how on-demand it is really depends on each pilot. But with your example in Putnam County, we need to be very clear that even a poor, low-performing bus route tends to get, or like what planners consider a low-performing bus route, tends to get at least 10 riders per hour. And that means you're getting someone on that bus about every 6 minutes or so. Imagine one of these services picking someone up every 6 minutes and still getting people to where they want to go in a quick, reliable fashion. We need to really think about what that means.
You've never been in Putnam County, I can tell you. Rosemary, let me get
We just had an event. I also chair the Sustainable Transportation Committee for the U.S. Green Building Council. And last week, we celebrated Car Free Day on Long Island. We also started celebrating Mobility Week. So as part of that week, we had an event last Tuesday that we titled Solving the First Mile, Last Mile Problem and downtown congestion parking problems with technology-enabled solutions, which is basically a long way of saying microtransit. But we focused on what the problem we were trying to solve in Nassau and Suffolk, because it's a Long Island. I learned a lot. I think a lot of people in the room learned a lot. We started with a panel discussion. I'll just say the various solutions that were highlighted there. We started with a panel discussion of some municipalities on Long Island that have implemented certain things already. So Nice Bus talked about their Nice Link pilot, which is a demand response route that's replacing some service that had been cut a few years ago. And the hope is that, there are some low-performance routes, and what's been happening on Long Island is they've been cutting the routes. So there's big transit deserts now in certain parts of Nassau County and Suffolk County. The hope of what I hear of a transit agency implementing demand response software for certain routes is that you can double your volume with half the cost. That's the promise. Because if you think about it, you've got like a vein going down, which is a fixed route service, and with the demand response in a particular service areas, it's like you got little capillaries going out picking up people, and you're only riding that smaller vehicle, which does have less fuel costs and less ongoing maintenance costs than the large vehicles when there's demand. And a lot of these buses are running empty a lot of the time, especially during the day. So whether that promise is there, but that is the promise, and doubling the volume on small volume is easy. As we're saying, it's not for the heavy-duty east-west routes that Nice Bus is running. It's for the complementary ones. So that was Nice Link. Port Washington has a problem with the first mile to the train station. They have limited parking now at the train station because the railroad needed some of the parking spaces for a yard. They're building for east side access. So they looked at an app that's out in the Bay Area being piloted called Scoop, which is a pure ride share, no cost to whatever. People basically sign up within a particular area and they request a ride the night before to the train station, and somebody accepts it and they get a dynamic ride share into the train station. It's not being piloted anywhere else, but it's being piloted through the MTC in the BART area. With whoever developed Scoop and some funding. But I think that's particularly interesting on Long Island as we grow capacity with third track and not have to necessarily, as TOD is expanding in the areas on Long Island, the land around the train station is becoming more valuable. So to build out more parking lots and more valuable land, if there's alternative solutions with microtransit. However, to get people to the first mile. The other problem we have is the last mile, which is on Long Island. We have business parks along Route 110 that are a couple of miles from the Farmingdale train station or from the Huntington train station, from the Amityville train station. So most people are still driving there or carpooling. If we had some kind of a feeder kind of system to that, and Chariot was there as one of the presenters talking about, they have it mostly an enterprise model is how they're doing it on Long Island, where they'll go to businesses and basically sell seats on the thing. They have 14-passenger van. They can have multiple companies buying multiple seats on it, and then if they can get multiple trips back and forth to the train station, their target is to get the cost per ride down to about $5, which is about a little less than a straight taxi, but still a lot, in terms of adding on top of other fares and the like. But that's their model right now. Another model with Huntington, they just implemented Quick Ride. That's a sponsorship-based electric vehicle that kind of takes people around town, takes them to the train station. There's no cost to the municipality. It was the Chamber of Commerce and the bid that negotiated all this with Quick Ride. The vendors within the storefronts in Huntington are paying for the vehicle, and it's helping to reduce congestion and parking issues in the downtown. We had a parking consultant that talked about the Summit, New Jersey model. There, they were going to build a parking garage, and they calculated the cost of the garage with all the maintenance. And it was, and they chose to do a partnership with Lyft instead, where the parking cost was $4 a day. So they charge the people to get to the train station $2, and the Summit, the city, subsidizing the balance, and they avoided having to build a parking garage based on it. And I think it was like $100,000 a year savings on top of when they calculated it. The other vendors that were there was Transloc. They're working with Suffolk County Transit for a demand response platform to try to do the similar thing to what NYCE is doing. You know, NYCE is operated by Transdev, so they're a technology company. They use their technology for NYCE in Suffolk County, they're working with Transloc, who has a demand response platform as well. There's another company out of Barcelona called Shuttle that I've seen a demo for, and the way they're really pretty cool how the demand response software is, because they use the app to reserve the ride, but then they use that data to schedule the driver to go in such a way to meet the service level that they committed to the driver. So it says you'll be there in 15 minutes, then they'll put them along around, won't pick up other people so that they can meet those commitments, so you won't end up with the kind of problems we have with paratransit. People think they're supposed to be there and then they're constantly complaining. We also had Free Ride, which is similar to Quick Ride. They're out on the East End and they're in a lot of cities around the country. Also a advertiser-sponsored model where you can call the bus, electric vehicles with an app, and they'll come pick you up and take you around town. And then we had Zagster. Suffolk County just signed a contract with Zagster for a bike share system across Suffolk County that will be funded through sponsorship, and they talked about that in terms of potential first mile, last mile, kind of solutions. So my point is that there's a lot out there, and we saw a lot of applicability to Long Island, and there's a whole bunch of different models. And so it might not be appropriate to New York City, but these things are very appropriate to the suburban areas that have a real first mile, last mile problem and parking congestion issues in downtown that's growing.
So, Kirk, what do you think about the idea of sort of a hybrid model where, these things aren't going to replace transit, but can they supplement transit, and can they work in areas where line haul transit doesn't work?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, like Rosemary pointed out a lot of great examples, let's just hold them to a standard. I mean, if we're going to commit public dollars to these services, let's make sure we're getting value from our public dollars and responding to needs that, we're responding to needs in the best way that we can make our investment. A lot of the time we could do similar investments in bus service in some of these places, and we need to ask where a lot of that cost savings that these companies are promising is coming from. And a lot of the time, yes, it can be maintenance, but it's also from the driver's comp. And are we willing to provide the service based on the fact that we're just paying the drivers less, and they're the ones who are eating the cost for it?
Any other questions, comments about this idea? They're going to run out of hipster names soon, too many services and not enough names.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm actually going to be getting into a lot of some of these issues in my presentation too, but I just did, I'll really talk about it from the perspective of a transit operator. But there are issues also when you take a fixed route, even if it is the most, a very inefficient route when you're replacing, union labor. Non-union labor, there are things that you really have to account for. So, I'll definitely get into some of those issues.
Right. Okay, join me in thanking Kirk for a great presentation. Okay, so now we're going to get into a discussion of integrated corridor management. So we have Andrew Weeks here from New York City DOT. The city received a grant working with NYMTC and the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority to look at the I-49 from 495 corridor from northern New Jersey through to Queens, essentially. You'll get into all that. And the idea was how to bring the management of this incredibly complicated corridor under some kind of a model where it could be better integrated. So I'm going to call up your PowerPoint. So this has been completed now. The grant was in
the application was in January of 2014. The award was February of 2015, and then we finished in June of 2017.
So again, this is a concept that's very much relevant to what we're looking at in this network. So,
Thank you, Gary. So my name is Andrew Weeks. I'm with the New York City Department of Transportation. I was the agency project manager. We worked closely with agency partners, the MPOs, NYMTC, and JTPA. Our partner on the grant was New York State DOT, some members in the room today, and closely with our local FHWA representative, Arthur O'Connor. So we've, had a lot of meetings related to this project, a lot of familiar faces. If there's anything you want to bring up related to your experiences as we went through this process, please feel free to chime in. Also, our consultant teams were ICF and ARIP. So just a little background. CONOPS is a concept of operations, which is a fancy name for a planning document. And in the ITS systems engineering process, the CONOPS really represents the first deliverable, which is a planning document that identifies the corridor in question, the issues facing the corridor, the user needs, and then outlines a number of strategies for integration and coordination that ultimately move along the systems engineering process through system requirements, implementation and deployment of ITS devices and systems to actually realize the strategies and the mitigation measures that are outlined in the CONOPS. This started many years ago, I think as early as 2011. We started having local conversations amongst regional agencies regarding just general concepts of ATDM and what is considered ICM, or Integrated Corridor Management. At that point, it was a federal program that had 2 pilot sites that are well documented. There was I-15 in San Diego, and I forget the route, but it was in Dallas, 75. Those 2 were considered pilot sites for ICM and went through a sort of the entire systems engineering process to implementation, and then they were sort of functioned as test beds, but also sources of lessons learned for other regions. Our conversations here ultimately led to a grant that came out from US DOT in January of 2014. By that time, we were well situated to actually do a grant application, present our corridor, which we call I-495, but really it is a 16-mile corridor starting in New Jersey. It's New Jersey 495, which right now is getting a lot of press because it's being rebuilt, through the Lincoln Tunnel, across 34th Street in Manhattan, through the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and then Interstate 495 out to the Van Wyck Expressway. We define the corridor a lot of times just basically with roadway names, but it's not just a roadway project. It's all modes and users that interface that corridor. It can be surface transit, it can be rail transit, drivers, freight, you name it. It could be even roadways or transit routes that just intersect the corridor and may be influenced by operations on that corridor. After we were given the award in February 2015, we started about 2 years worth of work, including a lot of stakeholder outreach, workshops, to talk through a lot of the issues facing the corridor, user needs, and then ultimately drive that discussion towards what are some of the institutional, operational, and technology measures that can be put into place and as described in the CONOPS that ultimately could go towards deployment, implementation, and at the end of the day, hopefully enhance the corridor mobility. Just briefly, what is ICM? It comes down to 4 main points. It's really coordination, and that goes for operations, response, multimodal, and that can even include mode shift for users en route from an origin to a destination. It's performance driven. It has to both rely on real-time data to drive operations, but also then to rely on those data to evaluate the response in the system after the fact. And then what we call a decision support or a decision support system that both helps operators and users better navigate the conditions on the corridor and to mitigate issues as they come up. We found early on that the models found in San Diego and Dallas weren't quite applicable to densely developed New York City. In particular, the San Diego and Dallas projects really were interstate corridors that had, one, a lot of capacity on adjacent service roads, had underutilized transit lines that were parallel to those corridors. And so really ICM there was, if there's an incident, we are going to actively manage traffic onto underutilized roadways or to have people shift to underutilized transit services, whether we trigger a park and ride notice that people can, if they're driving, there's an incident, they can get off at a particular location, and then there are systems in place for them to easily get a transit option to their destination. Here, our roadways are at capacity, our transit lines are at capacity. So we needed to find a more, I don't know, I guess I'd say a humble solution of what ICM is. And also, those projects relied a lot on what we call predictive modeling, where their decision support system, and we'll talk a little bit later about what the decision support system is, sort of brings in predictive modeling and some degree of automation into how the system responds to an incident. Here, because our corridor is multimodal, multi-jurisdictional, and very dense, and we have a very established system of operations amongst the different operating agencies, that as we are having these outreach with stakeholders and with the partner agencies, I would say there was pushback or resistance from operators who are more comfortable in responding to situations as it's sort of in a person-to-person sense and not put a computer in the driver's seat in terms of incident response. And then obviously security had a lot to play in terms of how one particular incident is managed versus another. And when I use the word incident, it could be something as simple as a breakdown. It could be a chemical spill. It could be a just recurring congestion. So all those things we had to talk about in terms of the decision support system and what gets elevated to an ICM level incident. So we chose the 495 corridor for a number of reasons. Those most likely or most apparent are that it's congested, it's highly unreliable. It's multimodal, so any incident is affecting both passenger vehicles, freight vehicles. There are a number of express and local buses that are interfacing the corridor, and then potential spillover into other modes, whether it be Long Island Railroad or New Jersey Transit or the city's subway system. Again, multi-jurisdictional, so the ICM toolbox towards improving cooperation and incident response and operations on a corridor level were important here because it's in the ConOps, but it's not in the presentation. There's actually a graph or a figure that shows all the different operating agencies that have some sort of governance or control over different portions of the corridor, and it's quite a few with 2 tunnels, local streets, highways, and transit operators. And sort of at the periphery are overarching agencies like the Office of Emergency Management and the MTA. So with that in mind and sort of talking through the issues on the corridor, how the corridor is established now, what its inventory and operational conditions are, We came up with 10 identified user needs, and really the CONOP is a definition of the user needs that drives later on the evaluation of the deployment back to the CONOP to make sure that your program actually satisfies the user needs identified back in the CONOPs. A lot of it is enhancement of situational awareness, which is, we have a lot of data in the corridor. It's a very data-rich region. ICM looked to go even further and make sure that the particular data relevant to the prevailing conditions or operations on the corridor were getting to the right people at the right time. The people I'm referring to normally are the numerous staff in our varied TMCs, or Transportation Management Centers, scattered throughout the city. Multiple agencies have these TMCs, making sure they're looking at the same thing and they're responding to the same incidents accordingly if needed. It's also decision support for both those operators, but also travelers on the corridor. Are they getting the information they need in a timely fashion to plan their trips, adjust their trip making, adjust their modes, and then also to set up a collaboration or coordination to make those user transitions more practical, more convenient, whether it be information about park and ride or information about alternative transit solutions on the corridor to meet their travels. And part of the overall users are also freight demand. Obviously, this corridor is a key link to the two large airports in Queens, and making sure that freight operators are also aware of or have a better situational awareness. So that's just a brief overview of the 10 core user needs by which the system and the strategies were developed. It sort of breaks down into three main categories for integration. There's operations, technology, and institutional. Right now we have a lot of very good technology and operational integration. We share, we have joint agencies in our traffic management centers, whether it be incident response, like City DOT, New York State DOT, NYPD, FDNY are in the JTMC in Long Island City. Port Authority has an operations center, the MTA has an operations center. There's a lot of communication that's already going on. We also have Transcom, which is a coalition of regional agencies that is facilitating data integration and has a robust operations map for real-time and historical queries. So we have a lot of that in place. Institutional is more of a heavy lift because while operators are integrating and collaborating on a incident-by-incident basis, institutionally, you have to embed that cooperation, that collaboration into longer-term strategies, strategic plans, business practices, staff training. There's a lot more that goes into that, and that requires a little more molding of the institutional framework to actually get something that can really make sure that ICM is operable but also sustainable into the future. So the CONOPS got into discussions about meeting those three core functions. Really what comes down to the institutional framework is an ongoing collaboration. Setting up a group of operators and planners that can, and even and policy and analysts that are continuously talking through and making sure that the ICM system is both functioning as it should, is funded the way it should be, but also making sure that its protocols are being driven forward through MOUs and agreements. MOUs or agreements could be something as simple as one agency allows another agency to put LPR cameras on their infrastructure and integrate it back into their TMC. Larger agreements could be staff sharing to make sure that the ICM decision support system is functioning at the JTMCs. The operational framework is fundamentally the DSS, or the decision support system. I'll get into in a few slides. And then just making sure that the ICM, we call it like the playbook, which is really the how to identify an ICM event, how to then respond to the ICM event in real time. Those strategies are sort of set down, even though there isn't an automated system that implements a strategy. There should be some degree of playbook that people know what to go to when an ICM event is established. So the two-element framework for day-to-day operations, there's the decision support system, and then there's the tools that feed into that decision support system. If you're familiar with our TMCs in the region, a lot of what you're seeing in terms of people at the table are either physically in the same place or they're all looking at the same thing. So we want to make sure that to implement and operate ICM, that there are staff allocated to the management of this particular corridor, whether they be in their particular agency's TMC or they be in a joint location of some sort. Because our TMCs are so well established in the region, we found that it's better to just have the lines of communication functioning, but they don't all have to be in the same location. I think the San Diego and Dallas model, a lot of those were either, they had a overarching operator, which was a transit agency or a Department of Transportation that had a single TMC or would establish a new TMC just for ICM. Whereas here, it's really just eyes on the corridor, but not necessarily in the same system. And really what the DSS is, as envisioned by the CONOPS, is an event is triggered. It could be an event that's even put into the system in terms of a planned event, or it could be an unplanned event. It could be recurring congestion. And the system, the data that's coming in, monitors those events, and then based on an established playbook would then say, this is elevating to an ICM level event where it's either its duration or the amount of modes affected or the amount of, or the number of agencies being affected over the length of the corridor requires a higher degree of coordination than what is considered the standard. This is a more complicated one. It's in the presentation. It's also in the concept of operations, which is online at 501 New York. We can send out the link afterwards. But really, this outlines where all the components of input and processing and response, whether it be an automated process or when it's the coordinator response, it's feeding information back to decision makers who then are coordinating on how to handle that situation. There's also a multi-level degree of ICM. There's two other ICM corridors. There's 287 over the new Tappan Zee Bridge, and there's ICM in the New Jersey Northeast corridor, which was a partner award to this particular grant. So there's a lot here to go through, and it also outlines who's external, who are the other agencies that aren't in the TMCs but are active participants if needed at an ICM level. For example, whether it be emergency response or emergency management, and how those those communication lines are integrated. So the ops framework outlines a number of enhanced tools for the individual agencies to manage their facilities. Excuse me. Those include different elements of improved corridor monitoring, enhanced traveler information, which is critical to help users make either pre-trip or en route decisions in response to in response to conditions on the corridor or expected conditions on the corridor. And then demand management, which plays into, again, traveler information and if there is room for active demand management, which is in response to an incident, there is a, we're facilitating a shift. Maybe it's mode, maybe it's even telecommuting if we get to that level of sophistication in the future where people are allowed to telecommute or people, park and ride facility is opened up so that people can actively shift modes. The coordinated incident and event management. This week in particular, we have an event going on at the United Nations, which directly affects the Queens Midtown Tunnel, directly affects this corridor, both in Manhattan and on both sides of Manhattan. That sort of event would, under an ICM framework, have a particular established set of responses and management strategies associated with it. That's not all inclusive. Anything can happen beyond what's expected for a planned event. It could become a security issue if something happens at a planned event, which could then have another tier of strategies associated with it. There are, related to this, a number of ITS improvements, whether it be technology on buses. Transit Signal Priority is a program that's going on in the city that certainly plays into coordination between different agencies and can affect corridor operations. Other ones may be better ways to use bus time data to get out traveler information, and then also affect maybe fare payment systems to make it easier to shift modes. If you have one system that you can pay for a bus, or you can pay for Long Island Railroad, you can pay for our subway, but on demand as needed. Those things can certainly help. And I know, like today, in current operations, they'll say cross-honoring fare payments. That's sort of a ad hoc version of what ICM is talking about, where an event has occurred, it affected some form of transit, and they're allowing people to actively shift to another form of transit. Work zone coordination, which is a particular beast unto itself in terms of management. A lot of things we do in terms of work zones are done overnight to avoid issues, but as we see with New Jersey 495 or the Pulaski Skyway, or work at the Kew Gardens interchange in Queens, there is a degree of management that can go into developing strategies to help disruptions due to work zones. And then a lot of active traffic management options. These things tend to be more localized in their deployment, but they can still have very important and lasting effects in terms of demand management and then handling conflict points along the corridor in terms of surface transportation. Importantly, the system, as I said, is performance-driven, so the ICM also needs to establish methods for coming back and doing after-action evaluations and see how the system's performing in terms of both those three frameworks I talked about, institutional, operational, and technology, and make sure that they actually are performing based on or meeting the performance goals of the project. They can even be, as someone at New York City Office of Emergency Management said, they particularly do what are called hot washes, which are after a particular event that emergency management was involved in. They do an after-action review and see what was the event and what was the response, and then what was the outcome. ICM can benefit from that sort of retrospective. So going back, there's the three main categories, and then there's a financial one at the end, which is related to benefit costs. But these are where you would anticipate the impact institutionally, operationally, and technologically from a better framework of coordination for a particular corridor. Obviously, there has to be some benefits associated with it because it's a program to improve conditions on the corridor and traveler experience. But that then should translate to savings in user costs, savings in fuel and emissions, ideally a shift to more sustainable modes, and those things have an effect on the benefits on the corridor. As part of the concept of operations, the team put together a benefit cost analysis. It's a standalone document, but it's also summarized in the concept of operations. That looked at a number of likely strategies along the length of the corridor, and then using those, using benefit cost models, an estimation of savings associated with ICM costs. And the outcome was about a 7-to-1. So just improving lost productivity, lost fuel, user costs. They established that. There's also savings associated with the agencies themselves. If there's better coordination in terms of technology deployments, staff allocation, there can be savings at the operator or the agency level as well. Just opening up for discussion. Obviously, funding for ICM is a critical component of the discussion. When this grant came out, it was called a Phase 1 grant, and there was something associated with it about the Phase 2, which was a potential grant that would maybe be available to Phase 1 awardees. That Phase 2 grant has not been issued yet, but there are other grants that come out of USDOT. There's a fun acronym, the ATCMTD, which is Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technology Deployment. And then obviously there's also the existing ITS budgets, which the agencies have, but everybody says, my budget's spoken for. So it's sort of trying to make inroads, find commonalities or efficiencies in the budget so that some of the deployment elements of ICM, because it does not have to be deployed all at once, can be incrementally achieved. Importantly, the concept of operations and the benefit cost analysis associated with it are justification and support for application. So if a grant comes out and, for example, the Advanced Transportation grant has a subcategory for ICM, the CONOPS is already there to justify trying to get a grant award for a particular deployment on the corridor. And then if there is a particular deployment, it has to continue through systems engineering. So it has to go through system requirements and has to identify what technology is going to be deployed, what the system integration is like, but it can be done incrementally. Like I said, continuing systems engineering is critical as needed for deployment. ICM planning versus implementation. At some point, ICM goes from a planning exercise to an operations exercise, and it's important that operations staff who are used to dealing with the here and now, the situation on the ground as it's emerging, may be a little bit myopic to looking out 10 years or 20 years to a deployment such as ICM, or even pursuing certain planning grants that could ultimately help with the ICM deployment. So the ICM conversation and venues like this are important to have both planners and operators at the table to talk through issues, see what's realistic near term and long term. Getting more champions for ICM in operations, particularly at the local level. And in general, ConOps, this particular ConOps development was a bottom-up process. Like I said, we started at like staff, peer-to-peer level in 2011, having conversations about this. Now that the ConOps is built or drafted, it's really to get some really good traction on it, getting a top-down push saying, we want ICM to be part of the long-term strategic goals for the region and for the agencies, obviously executive levels at the operating agencies, and the MPOs are critical to that discussion. A few other notes. Like I said, we'll send out the link for the concept of operations document. It has a lot more detail about the systems engineering process. It has a lot more about the strategies being discussed. This is a very brief overview. It has talked a lot about the corridor and the issues facing the corridor, what we call the corridor inventory document. It has the benefit cost analysis, and it also has the AMS, or analysis, modeling, and simulation scope, which is any ICM includes an analysis component for whatever tools or operations or strategies that are being explored for implementation to get a better sense on the actual benefits and costs associated with those. So with that,
great. Thank you, Andrew. I would urge you, as a member of NYMTC and so forth, to think about also bringing this back to the MPO tables, both here at NJTPA, rather than simply waiting for grants to. By the way, that acronym looks like something out of DNA, actually. So, Art, yeah, there you are. Do you have any, from the federal perspective, this was a deployment grant, and any reactions to what the city is?
Andrew, this project was one challenge, probably the first of its kind as far as getting together multimodally, in terms of transit and highway, and the complexities of this corridor. But to answer your question, the idea is to grow this corridor, not only here on this side of the river, but also with Solomon in terms of the Northeast corridor. I have found over the years, once you lose the momentum, then it's even that much more challenging. Funding-wise, the expectation was that phase 2, as Andrew mentioned, would have been readily available. That has not materialized. Be that as it may, there's nothing that prevents us from utilizing any other funding sources to advance both what New Jersey has done and certainly what we have done here on this side. But again, this is pretty much an incremental approach under the TSMO umbrella, and we're talking about a paradigm shift. I know the state DOT is morphing into bringing in TSMO in terms of our program. But again, it's really one step at a time. Right. This began with, if you can believe, scanning tours out into Seattle as far as their TDM program, and just sort of galvanizing the region to think more than just simply deploying ITS. It's really about integrating these systems into addressing both reoccurring and non-reoccurring congestion. So. Great summary, but we have some work to go. Funding-wise, I guess it's as good as mine. I know nothing as far as the availability of funding right now, but we shall see.
The NYMTC checkbook is right outside. So, and we have the great benefit here in this region of having Transcom, which is basically an MPO for operational agencies. Levine is here from Transcom. That framework for any of these efforts, not only here, but I-287 and other areas, both New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. That is a great advantage, I think, for our region to have that. So I know we're just about at time. One more thing to cover. So are there any pressing questions? Mary.
One of the things you said, that timely information was important. When I drive around, I use Waze, there's Google Maps. The MTA has the MTA app. The 511 program was good when it started, but no longer is useful. You don't want, they're putting signs up from your car, call 511. How do you stop a program that's been outdated? And redirect, don't laugh, and redirect those resources to one that's current, by phone.
511.
I get to fix that or that?
I think we touched on that in Andrew's presentation. The essence of ITS and operations, the foundation of that is really based on a system engineering approach.
Well, my question was, how do you stop?
So what we try to do is identify and nail down needs, which then feed into requirements. You're right, technology changes very quickly.
My question specifically was, how do you stop 511? Please answer that one.
How do you stop 511?
Yeah.
So there's a number of parts of it, and actually I'd like to take that up with you offline so that we can, because we are getting close to time. But it's a good question, and I will be here afterwards. Get some interesting thoughts about that. So thank you, Andrew, and we're going to move on quickly. A very detailed presentation, which is great because, as you can imagine, in a corridor like this, it is a very complex undertaking to try to organize all these different jurisdictions. So now, this is just going to be one shot. We're going to start a roundtable discussion today, if I can find the thing. And let me give you some background to this. So, Westchester County Executive George Latimer, who took office in January, right, has identified for NYMTC that transportation network companies are a real issue in Westchester County, and wanted us to take a look at that in a number of ways. In addition to that, newly elected Nassau County Executive Laura Curran also is looking at how these new emerging services can be melded in with what's happening with Nice Bus. County Executive Steve Malone is also interested. So there's a lot of movement here to look at transportation network companies in the context of overall transportation. So Naomi's going to start off the roundtable. This will be the only part today, but we're going to continue this roundtable discussion at subsequent meetings. She's going to talk about a study that was funded by NYMTC, right? Yes. Okay. You're welcome. Of first and last mile connections for the Westchester County B-line system that gets a lot into the existence of these TNCs. So, Naomi? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was there. Why don't you start and I'll get that up.
So, well, thank you everyone for good to be here today. As Jerry mentioned, I'm with the B-line system in Westchester County. We operate the B-line bus system in Westchester County, which is the second largest system in New York State after MTA New York City Transit. And earlier this year, we completed a study focusing on last mile connections and the issue of how TNC partnerships have been formed between municipalities and TNCs and transit agencies and TNCs to look at the issue of last mile connections and also to fulfill gaps and address gaps in transit systems and to address overall mobility. The goal was, as I said, looking at different TNC partnerships. We looked at a lot of case studies around the country and in the region. We identified the challenges, certainly from the perspective of a transit operator. And the idea was to come up with opportunities that were appropriate for Westchester to complement existing transit system, our existing transit service, and improve overall mobility in the county, and just identify the appropriate role for transportation network companies. Some of the examples we looked at, connections to train stations and bus stops replacement of underutilized fixed route bus service, access to off-peak jobs, using the technology platforms of TNCs, expanding markets where there are gaps in transit service, and looking at how TNCs have been used in some areas even to provide paratransit service. There are definitely a lot of challenges that have to be addressed if these services are going to be successful. One of them certainly is addressing and complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. A lot of the TNC companies that have vehicles, but they're not always accessible to people with disabilities. There are also a lot of equity issues that need to be looked at because not everybody has access to a smartphone. And also research shows that people who use TNCs tend to have higher incomes than those that don't. So there's some Title VI issues there. Also, the cost of these TNC trips, while they might be less than a taxi trip, they're generally higher than the cost of a transit trip. As I was saying earlier, labor union issues, if you replace service that's provided by unionized workers with non-unionized, you can have certainly a lot of issues there. And then there's also the issue of a lot of these TNC operators, they are not unionized. The issue of operating arrangements, really thinking about whatever operating arrangement you form, making sure that you are serving the public interest. And also the issue of data sharing. A lot of these TNCs consider their data proprietary. They don't want to share it, and it can be very critical to benchmarking and evaluating your service and determining where you want to go with it. Another issue is the negative externalities here. There are studies that have recently been done. There was one major study by UC Davis last fall, and the Bruce Schaller study people are probably familiar with that looked at these types of services in New York City, is that they are associated with an increase in traffic, and one thing we really would want to avoid is decline in transit use, particularly bus service has been going down nationwide, and we wouldn't want something that is going to siphon off bus riders. So if something is done, we want to really make sure that it's done properly. And then finally, these are some of the case studies that we look at, and I know some of these were mentioned earlier in the discussion. The Summit, New Jersey, I know Rosemary mentioned it. The focus was access to a train station, and the idea there was to reduce the fact that they would have to expand parking at the station, and that is definitely a relevant issue for us in Westchester. The idea that municipalities don't want to have to take valuable land in downtowns, devote them for cars to sit all day, and it also addresses the issue too that commuters don't want to necessarily have to buy a car, have an extra car just to go to a station, drive a couple miles every day, and it sits at a station all day. So that was one example, and that was one of the first examples of a municipality partnering with a TNC. Another one was SEPTA, the Philadelphia Transit System. They had a partnership to provide service to 11 train stations. It was very successful. It increased transit use. The Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority, and they looked at access to bus stops. There was one program called that provided access to bus stops called Direct Connect. But then another interesting program they had was a late shift program for economically disadvantaged commuters. San Clemente, California, and Orange County, and Dublin, California, were services that replaced underutilized bus routes. The one in Dublin, which was called Go Dublin, was in the San Francisco area and was a feeder to a BART station. And then also the Austin program was mentioned earlier. That was a partnership with VIA to use their technology platform for an on-demand type service in a geo-fenced area. And then it's too bad Kirk had to leave. He did talk about the Kansas City microtransit model. which unfortunately was not successful, and I think that was probably for a variety of reasons, and they did a lot of research and interviews, and they found that one thing that they did get out of it was they got a sense of who uses the type of service. So there were definitely some lessons learned. They said that the car ownership is very high, and given the land use patterns and just the market, it was a new service where there wasn't any prior transit service between two different neighborhoods, and there just wasn't a high demand also for it, for transit in general. And then the MBTA in the Boston area, they have a paratransit model, and that is similar to a model that we already have in Westchester called parataxi, but we researched this one anyway. There were some parallels with what we do where people can take a for-hire car service for a paratransit trip, and it is at a reduced cost to us. So kind of going forward, we definitely learned a lot here as far as potential markets that would be feasible possibly to serve with TNCs. And they tend to be some of our least efficient routes, like going to train stations or to corporate parks in the I-287 corridor, or looking at areas where there is not a lot of density, where it could make sense to serve a market with a TNC as opposed to a fixed route bus service. So where we're going now is this was mentioned also earlier, is that we're undertaking a bus re-envisioning study similar to what New York City has done, similar to what was mentioned. Austin, Houston has done these studies, really kind of looking at a clean slate and kind of incorporating some of the findings here into that, and really looking at overall mobility needs and trying to hone in further on what the right niche is for the TNCs in the whole transportation network.
Thanks, Darren. Quick question. Oh, go ahead. And by the way, the second study is also potentially funded by NYMTC. So, you're welcome. So these TNCs are operating in Westchester County right now, right?
Yes, they do have the authority to operate.
So, to get them to do what you think you want them to do, why aren't they doing it now?
Well, this would really require some kind of a formal agreement or partnership for us to require them to do operate how we would want them to operate. So they're operating all over the place, individual trips. You know, if we were to undertake something, we'd want it to be some kind of a focused effort, possibly a geo-fenced area, and we'd want it to be designed so that the likelihood would be we'd want some kind of shared ride type service as opposed to all these individual cars increasing traffic in the county. So it's more, it would be a way to focus it. And if a municipality were interested, we've had some discussions, if we're not in a position right now to operate something like this, but if a municipality were interested, we would certainly want to work with them to make it successful and make it so that it's done properly, so that it isn't competing with us, so that it really is done in an efficient way.
So would there be subsidization of the costs to the rider of the Uber?
It's not really clear yet. I mean, there's a lot of examples where there are definitely subsidies, and they're provided in different ways. In some instances, the subsidy is just provided because there's a savings from the service that it's replacing. If it's replacing a fixed route and the service is being provided at a reduced level, reduced cost, there's a savings there.
So, Rosemary, how does this sound compared to, say, some of the things that are happening on Long Island?
I think that there's a lot of open questions right now. All of the issues you brought out are all the things I'm hearing on Long Island. Right now, the TNCs have authorization to operate. There's no restrictions. Legislative Fleming on Suffolk County was advocating that there be a fee, a tax basically on the ride that would help to subsidize the buses. because of the look, you know, of transit ridership going down, but was not successful at that. It was kind of driven from the state that it would be implemented across. But there are issues, and as you mentioned, the union issues, the labor issues, it's a lot of questions. I think that the Summit New Jersey model, though, showed that you can work out something where it saves money overall, and maybe some of that savings was used towards, you know, funding other, you know, solutions than parking garages. So I don't know the answer, but they should be part of the mix, I hope.
Yeah, I think what was interesting
Bob.
Winners.
The very side. The other Bob.
No, another thing that was interesting about Summit, I think, was that instead of buying a parking permit, you pay for the price of a parking permit, and you were guaranteed a certain number of trips. So it seemed like it was a very straightforward model as far as how it was implemented.
So, I mean, this is a first step in a roundtable that's going to span several meetings, because we want to hear from potentially next time Nassau or Suffolk counties who are both looking at this, and also have discussions with other organizations about what they think the potentials are here. But are there any last questions or comments about Naomi's presentation? Okay, great. So, no. Okay. Just keep it rolling. Okay. Transportation analogy. So very quickly, to finish up, thank you to all the presenters for what you gave us today. A lot of information today. We did manage to stay within our 2 hours, which is great. We had been meeting, the network had been meeting, Jan, once every quarter before, right? So we're proposing that we continue with that frequency. We're all very busy and there's lots of stuff to do. So more frequent would probably be an intrusion. That being the case, we'd like to suggest that the last Wednesday in January, which is January 30th, be the next time we meet, assuming no snowstorms or what have you. There's a couple of agenda items we want to suggest for that, including continuing the TNC roundtable. Also, Steve, it would be great to hear about the strategic planning that's going on at Transcom. It would be a great topic for this network. And there are others, including David, you mentioned New York City Consumer Affairs, to talk about the benefit in New York City. That would probably be a worthy topic. So there's several things here that we can work into the next agenda. Sure. And Solomon, Jan wants you to do something at the next meeting. I quite know what, but
I'm stomping it a bit down here.
Okay. Great. And I want to thank Jan, as always. Jan is a key part to putting this together. So if you want to applaud for Jan, please do. So with that, I think we're done 4 minutes early. Thank you all for your time. What?
You want yielding me 1 minute?
After adjournment? Come on.
Well, before adjournment, if that's all right, as a participating member, the opportunity for having this group around the table, I think, shouldn't go or be considered a passive opportunity. I think, Jerry, if, you know, there's a lot of content, a lot of input that many folks probably want to offer. I'm sitting over here drooling over some of the things we talked about that I'd like to submit. But maybe a half hour more. You know, you got folks traveling from Albany and all over the region. We have exciting things going on, this topic and these focuses. To get all this out in one session, you know, I would expect maybe more time, even a half an hour.
You're not suggesting that today, are you?
I would. I live in Jersey City, so I'm not going far. I would love to stick around.
No, that's fine.
It's worth consideration, and if you could add that to the formal meeting minutes, it'd be appreciated.
Sure, no, that's fine. I mean, we can even look at providing, if we went a little over 2 hours or something like that, providing a little bit of a break at some point, because it does get to be long, but we'll certainly keep that in mind because we're only meeting quarterly. So, and if anybody is really bored at the end of 2.5 hours, Solomon is the person to blame. So, thank you all. I think we're at adjournment at this point. Thank you all for your time. Murray, I will be available. So. Thank you, everyone.
Don't forget us, don't forget those of us